Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Ation, you're up this week.
Yes.
What have you brought to the table today?
I am bringing 2 articles.
Look at you, overachiever.
Yeah. Have we done 2 articles before?
Probably.
On one,
Yes.
On one episode?
Yes.
All right. Well, there's not a first for everything.
That's right.
Today, at least. I don't know. But the first article is Why Protests Work Even When Not Everybody Likes Them. And the second is How to Make Sure Your Disruptive Protest Helps Your Cause. They were both published by Waging Nonviolence and written by Mark Engler and Paul Engler. The first one focuses on polarization.
Yep.
And the second one does too, really. But the first one introduces this concept, which I think we frequently talk about with a negative connotation. I mean in the broadest sense of, the United States.
Yes.
Because I think it's predominantly seen as a right-wing tactic, and rightfully so, for good reason. I think people say polarization and you think, okay, we're polarizing based on like race, or we're polarizing based on immigration status, or we're using that as a polarization. But this article really focuses on acknowledging polarization and working with it rather than ignoring it, because polarization really just means that people are taking sides on an issue.
Absolutely.
And they say in the first article, quote, "But it is essential for progressive movements to recognize that polarization is a force they can use as a tool rather than something that simply must be avoided."
Yes.
And I think this brings us to the point of the second article, which is how do you try to bring as many people to your side as possible with your actions? And they focus in the article on these 5 factors for helping your cause. And so it's using this thought process of polarization to your advantage.
Right.
So the first is the framing of the cause through the movement's demands. The second is the balance of disruption and sacrifice. The third is sympathetic actors and unsympathetic targets. The fourth is media and public relations capabilities. And the fifth is timing and intangibles. And I really appreciated this as a framework for understanding how to harness that polarization concept to encourage as many people as possible to join your side. And there's a lot of great explanation throughout both articles about all of this. And so I'm excited to get into this today. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, these were really great pieces that worked so well together. I mean, I think in so many ways, the first set the stage, right? And the second was really this incredible on-the-ground exploration of this topic in so many ways. And I just appreciated the analysis of protest in the context of our society and in our progressive movements for change, as you talk about. So,
and I really paused before I brought both last week. I was like, should I bring both? Should I only bring one? And I'm glad I'm glad I brought both, because I think they probably could have just been one really long article. But I appreciated them being 2 separate things to give a pause between the 2. But I don't think it would have been smart to bring one without the other.
Right. No, not in our context for our podcast. And really, I think if you're engaged in this work and you're reading these pieces, you definitely need to read them both, because I think they are so well done, and there's a lot to learn from these pieces, whether you're on the front lines engaged in protests and protesting for an issue or cause, or whether or not you're witnessing and are learning about the issue. And you talk about that polarization piece. And so there's a lot to learn here and a lot to talk about. I read the Why Protests Work piece first, which I think you're supposed to.
It was published first.
I didn't notice that. And in that one, I really appreciated how it named both how important protests are in trying to make change happen, and also why protests are important, right?
Yeah.
So they say this in the piece, quote, "Given the urgency of the challenges in our world, this wave of disobedient and determined action should generally be regarded as a positive development, because it breaks the rhythms of orderly business in society, forcing both the public and those in positions of power to pay attention to issues of great importance that might otherwise be downplayed or ignored. Disruption is a vital tool of civil resistance." Right? And I think we're in a time, as they name so aptly here, where the issues we face are so immense and so important and impact people's everyday lives. And so this kind of action, I think, is critical. The idea of protests, I think, are critical. And
Yeah.
and the piece goes on to talk about how organizers can best think about and strategize and engage with protest or engage in protest in the most effective ways. And as you say, capitalize on that polarization.
Right.
And that obviously continues on to the second piece. And so, yeah, I appreciate this piece so much. And I hope that folks who are engaged in this work, engage with it, engage with these pieces. But I think all of us can learn a lot about the idea and the notion of protest as a tool in the overall strategy of the work that we're trying to do.
Yeah, and there are so many different ways you can do it too, which
Yeah.
I get into later, which I think we'll talk about in a little
Yeah,
bit. But I really appreciated, we talked about this already a little bit too, but the way they ended the first piece really set up the next one.
Yeah.
You can tell these are connected thought processes. They flow together nicely.
Yeah.
But at the end of the first piece, they say, quote, "When any disruptive protest takes place, dismissive pundits will ask with exasperation, what do they want? Movements need not answer these detractors on the terms they demand, but for the public, they must make their answer as self-evident and compelling as possible."
Yes.
And so this was written in the context at the end of the article of understanding the protest shaming that happens in the media with pundits and whatnot, and in recognizing the amount of protest cynicism that there is, where lots of people just don't think that protests are effective.
Right.
And I've heard that in random conversations with people, that
Yeah,
people
absolutely.
just generally like, what's the point?
Right.
Of
Why are
this.
you doing this? Is it really going to help?
Yeah. And when we recognize these two dynamics, we can work with that. We can
Yes.
respond to it in that context. We can understand what these 5 factors are about that they name that I mentioned earlier, to understand how to move forward and make these questions easily answerable.
Yep.
If that is the goal. Like, if it is the goal for people to understand what your protest is about, right, that's an element to think about.
Absolutely.
And, or as they say, to make the purpose of the action as self-evident and compelling as possible.
Right.
How are we winning people over to our side of the polarization? How are we encouraging them to take a stand
Yes.
on our side with us based on the action that we take? And I think that sets up so nicely for the second piece.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and I love the fact that you name the media in this, because the media plays a role in this as well.
Yeah.
In so many ways, how we hear about and learn about protests, particularly protests and things like protests happening in places where we're not physically located, right? I think
Yeah.
about what happened at the encampments at Columbia University and watching some of the more progressive news coverage that I watched. I mean, even the way in which the pundits talk about it and some of the folks on the ground. I mean, even for a more progressive network, I was a little disappointed in how they were talking about the protests and the actors and the folks involved and reporting about it.
Yeah.
And that is what people sitting on their couches are listening to and hearing about this. And it's helping to inform their opinions about
Yeah.
what's going on.
Yeah, it shapes so much about what we think about
Yes.
these kinds of things. So that cynicism, I think it's a real dynamic, and it's also a manifestation of the ways that pundits and the media talk about these things.
Yes.
And all because people are doing things outside of the standard channels of change,
Oh, yeah.
outside of the system, the way that things are supposed to work. And so there's a lot to that.
Absolutely. We're trying to set us up so nicely to jump to that second piece, but I want to name the second piece, but I want to name one more thing that stood out to me in the first piece. They have this really great resource. It was called the Spectrum of Support.
Oh yeah,
It was
this is great.
A graphic, a tool that the organization, it's called Momentum Training, uses in their work. And Momentum Training is actually an organization that was co-founded by Paul Engler, and they adapted this spectrum of support tool from a Quaker organizer and activist named George Lakey. So I just wanted to make sure we gave credit there. So for folks listening, the spectrum of support is this half circle. Think of it sort of visually as a gas tank gauge, where on the far right is the opposition, then it clicks over to the active opponents, then it's passive opponents, then it's the neutral folks in the middle, and then there are the passive supporters, then the active allies, and then lastly, it's the folks engaged in the movement and the protests themselves. And what I appreciated, I think, about how Mark and Paul talk about this tool and about how to use it is what movements can do to win. So they say, quote, "For movements to win, they do not need to convince their worst enemies to change. Instead, they win by turning neutrals into passive supporters and turning passive sympathizers into active allies and movement participants. Meanwhile, they should aim to whittle away at ranks of the opposition, making them less resolute, active, and committed, even if these people never move beyond being neutral at best. As 350.org puts it, the good news is that in most social change campaigns, it is not necessary to win over the opponent to your point of view. It is only necessary to move the central pie wedges one step in your direction. That means our goal is not to convince the fossil fuel industry to end themselves. Instead, it is moving the rest of society to shut them down.
Yes.
And that piece I like. It's moving the rest of society to shut them down. And I thought this was a really great thing for activists and folks engaged in protest work to keep in mind. The other piece that they talk about that I think is so critical to keep in mind is how the directional movement can go both ways. So that this gets that polarization piece. The more polarizing the issue and the protest is to some folks, it might cause the opposition to grow as well. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. And this tool, I think, is a great visual reference and resource for folks engaged in this work.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I wanted to talk about that. So I appreciate you bringing that here. And as I think about it too, the middle wedge, the way that the movement works is that, you mentioned the goal is to turn the active people into neutrals.
Yeah.
Right? Once you're neutral, you don't know where you're going to go.
Right.
And it's just interesting how you think about how to then use that tool to think about how you structure your movement, structure your different actions to disrupt something or to tell a story about something that disrupts that action later. Right? We use fossil fuels as an example there. Yeah, it's all in play, and it all helps guide the way that you might make a choice about your action.
Absolutely.
And so they go on to talk about another model that's a part of the second factor in the second article, which is the one about the balance of disruption and sacrifice.
Yes.
And I thought this was another really compelling way to think about the impact of a protest and how to steer polarization to your side. As they write about a list of protest tactics that were put together by somebody else in the 70s, I think. Okay, yeah. They say, quote, "It is possible to place each of the tactics on a chart measuring on one axis the level of disruption it creates, and on another the level of sacrifice it entails. Based on their placement, the tactics on the chart would fall into one of four quadrants. And those four quadrants are high disruption, high sacrifice." So, and in this context, sacrifice is about the sacrifice of the people who are in the movement.
Right.
That kind of sacrifice. And disruption is about sort of public disruption. And so high disruption, high sacrifice is usually stuff like occupations and major strikes. Mm-hmm. High disruption, low sacrifice are road blockades or disrupting an event that maybe somebody's speaking at.
A Broadway show,
things like that.
Right, exactly.
Yes. High sacrifice, low disruption, something like hunger strikes. It might be something that you can get some publicity around, but it's not disrupting business as usual for the vast majority of people. And then low sacrifice, low disruption are things like banners, petitions, permitted rallies. Those might be those things that get the ball rolling for people to understand that this is an issue, that this is something that we need to pay attention to. It's an it feels like the awareness building kind of phase. Right. And then the rest feel like the I don't know, amplification of that. Yeah. Right? Moving beyond awareness into other pieces of disruption. And so I really like this because it helps us think about how an action might be received. Is it going to be disruptive and put the cause in front of a lot of people? Mm-hmm. And what's their reaction maybe going to be to that? Or is this a smaller, quieter action that we can use to leverage for telling our story in a different way or maybe a more impactful way or something? Because I think there's lots of ways to do these actions. The list they were referring to has 168 tactics on it.
Wow.
And it's been updated relatively recently to include over 300 actions. So there's lots of different ways to do this kind of work, to do protests, to do demonstrations. And you have to think about, what's the impact going to be? And are you a high disruption, high sacrifice, or low disruption, low sacrifice, or somewhere in between?
Absolutely. Well, I love the questions that you asked there too. Is it going to be disruptive and put in front of a lot of people, or is it smaller and quieter? So these pieces and the tools within them and the resources within them help you really think about and name, okay, what are we going for? And what are the questions we need to consider? And are we okay with that? Are we okay with that? Okay, let's keep going and answer the next question. And so you understand what your protest is and it's going to look like and the impact it's going to have as you talk about.
It's purpose driven, right?
Yes.
It gives you a clear purpose to then be able to talk about with people.
Absolutely.
Externally.
Absolutely. Yeah. The second piece was so great. And I like you started to talk about the second factor. These factors are such practical advice, right? And I think are really worthwhile spending time with. And there's so much about the work that I think you can't prepare for sometimes. And so these factors and these questions and this resource allow you to prepare as best as possible, which I think is helpful.
Yeah, they name that in a couple of these.
Yeah.
One of them is very specific about it. But
so I took some notes on all 5 of them, and I just kind of wanted to briefly run through them. You did such a great job talking about the second one. The first was the framing of the cause through the movement's demands. And so that's all about how important it is to make the why behind your protest and your demands really clear to the public. So again, 2 was the balance of disruption and sacrifice. So that's all about creating a concrete plan and how it will play out in practice and the impact it's going to have on people. The third one was sympathetic actors and unsympathetic targets, which is all about, I think, this notion of shining a light on human faces of the conflict and putting the story in a context that the public can understand and where they can see and understand the injustice at play. The fourth was media and public relations capabilities, which I think is so important, especially in our social media news at our fingertips day and age that we're living in. But so it's all about how organizers are engaging with the media, the traditional media, the non-traditional media. But they also need to have a strong, I think the words they use were external facing communications team and strategy, like figuring out how do we use the media to our advantage. And then the last one was timing and intangibles. And so this is the one we were just talking about a little bit. Like it's this catch-all factor of things you can't necessarily plan for. If the day you're going to do your protest, there's a major earthquake and lots of people die, that's going to take attention away from what it is that you're doing. And you need to pivot in that moment and make some decisions about what it is that you want to do. And so those, again, are just timing and intangibles.
Yeah.
And I just appreciated this piece and they spend a good amount of time on all 5 of them, right? And thorough explanations, examples of how they played out in past movements and in protests and in our society in general. And so there's just, again, a lot I think folks can learn from these factors.
Yeah, and one of the things that I remembered as you were talking about this is the sympathetic actors and unsympathetic targets.
Yeah.
So they talk about the context of opposing the military budget.
Right.
And how much it is. And that having potentially an automatic negative context for people because they think you're taking money away maybe from veterans or from veteran support services or something like that. But they gave the example of, well, no, if you target then military contractors and you list out like, well, look, this was a $200 screw and a $6,400 toilet seat and a $3,200 coffee maker or whatever the examples were, which were real examples, I think, that were used in a campaign years ago. You can then steer the conversation away from, this isn't about, taking away healthcare from military veterans. Right. It is about how do we cut waste so that we could spend that $6,400 on a toilet seat maybe on the military veterans or maybe on other people who need that $6,400 from some other reason.
Absolutely.
Maybe that money goes towards free and reduced lunch programs for schools.
Yes.
There's other ways that we can then spend that money that is not $6,350 more than what a toilet seat actually costs.
Yes. Absolutely. And that's how their point is that's how you get people on board with, your movement and your action. Yeah.
One small example that I was reminded of as you were talking about that unsympathetic target.
Right.
All right. Well, let's talk about application. We're starting to do it anyway. Yeah. How does this apply to our day-to-day lives? I think the framework of understanding polarization, we've already talked about it a lot, but I think understanding polarization more broadly is super helpful.
Yes.
And recognizing that it's not inherently negative, which I think is a lesson we learned a little bit while we read Solidarity a few months ago.
Yeah.
The lesson that I recall from that is that we have to define who we're with and who we're not with, and that can be divisive.
Yes.
And we create coalitions based on who we share values or goals with, but it's about separation based on belief or politics that challenge the necropolitics and help us develop humanity to the highest level possible, to borrow a couple concepts and a quote from the last few episodes that we've had here.
Absolutely.
So, but what about you?
I love that polarization. I love that you really have drilled that point home for us, because it's one that when I was reading these pieces, I was like, oh, yeah, I get that. Polarization is something that exists but can be misinterpreted or interpreted in one way, but it means more than that. It needs to be more understood more broadly than I think we typically apply it in our daily lives.
Yeah, and one of the things...
in this context, I should say.
Yes, and one of the things that they said was the opposite of polarization isn't unity necessarily, but is usually suppression.
Oh, yes.
And
yes.
I think that was an idea put forth by Ezra Klein that they quoted in the article. But yeah, polarization, the opposite of that is not unity necessarily, but suppression by typically some kind of government entity or what have you. It might be a cultural suppression, any number of ways it could be suppressed. But yeah, it's another way that really changed the way I thought about it too.
Absolutely. No, I love that. I think for me, the application of all of this is this idea of just how important protest is, and that we have to continue to fight for our liberation. So one of the things I love that they talked about in the Why Protest Work piece was this. They say, quote, "To be clear, in the face of injustice, action is preferable to silence." And that reminds me of Desmond Tutu's famous quote, "If you're neutral in systems of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor." And so, to be clear, in the face of injustice, action is preferable to silence. They then go on to say this, quote, "Protest movements take a gamble when they unsettle the status quo, but it is a risk worth taking. For it is only when movements appreciate how polarization can be used as a tool that they are poised to make their greatest gains." And so that's the application of all of this to me, right? So we have to protest, we have to fight. And while the analysis I think provided here and the resources to hone and refine protests are so important and so worthwhile, I think the power of protest is really what's undeniable and important and necessary for us.
Yeah, because it's the only way that we can move some of those people from that neutral wedge in the middle.
Absolutely.
Somewhere. And sometimes it's not going to go the direction we would like it to.
Right.
But if you can't tell the story about why people should care, it's hard for them then to care, because there's so many other things going on. And I think the way that our society is structured is for us to go to work, come home, cook dinner, go to bed, take care of the kids, do whatever it is you need to do in your personal life, and then do the same thing over and over again until you retire and then die. And I think waking people up out of that with a good old-fashioned protest of some kind into caring about something beyond that day-to-day normal reality routine is the only way to do that.
Absolutely.
All right, well, let's talk about homework. What are we going to do to continue our learning and unlearning beyond our conversation today? I want to dive into the nonviolence tactics database that I mentioned a little bit earlier, just because I think it'd be great to be more aware of more tactics for civil disobedience than what's the more obvious things that have happened in history, like boycotts and strikes and petitions and road blockades and banner drops and event disruptions and those kind of things. What are all the other 300 things that are in that database? Wow. And obviously I won't read all 300, but just to dive in and get a sense of what are these things and what's
absolutely
what's available as a tool for protest. What are the tools that are available to all of us?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, with a list like 300 long, I'm sure there are lots of things that we haven't even thought of. So I think there's so much to learn from that database. So I'm excited to check that out. I'm going to do it, Aaron. I'm going to add another book to our reading list. Yes. He's been looking for a reason to use that, folks. So Mark and Paul co-wrote a book called "This is an Uprising: How Nonviolent Revolt is Shaping the 21st Century." And it examines the power and core principles of protests and how they've been used as a guide for the work of transformative action. So I think it's a book basically continuing this conversation that we've had today. So I'd love to read that. Paul also has co-founded a couple of organizations that I'd love to check out. So the first is called the Center for the Working Poor, which is based out in LA. And the second is called Momentum Training, and I brought them up earlier. They train hundreds of activists every single year. And so I would just love to learn more about some of the work that these organizations have done and what they're all about, and see what more we can learn and take from them.
Yeah, that's great homework. I've been wanting to read This Is an Uprising for a long time now. So
I'll definitely put it on our list.
We'll add it to the list.
Very good.
All right, sounds good. Well, Damien, you're up next time, what are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yeah. So for next week, I'm going to bring a piece from In These Times called Spurned by the DNC, The Uncommitted Movement Staged a Sit-In. And it was written by Iman Abdelhadi. It was published back in late August in the midst of the Democratic National Convention. Iman is an activist, writer, sociologist, and professor over at University of Chicago, where she researches American Muslim communities. And she was also present at the sit-in, and I believe gave a speech at it, which is really cool. So I should say I have not read this piece yet at all, like not a single word of it, but it seems to be part reporting on, part timeline, and part analysis of the DNC's refusal to allow a vetted speech by a Palestinian to be given on the DNC stage, like given time during that event, and what the uncommitted movement is fighting for in the context of this election, but also I think more broadly. So I'm excited to read this piece because I think we've talked a little bit about the uncommitted movement and that effort. And so I just kind of want to amplify the work that they're doing and what's important to them and see what more we can learn about the great work that they're doing. And this is obviously a real life thing that has happened. And I think, folks have lots of feelings about it, rightfully so. I'm excited to see what more we can learn about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I was sort of following this during the DNC, and looking forward to diving a little bit more into it through this article. So yeah, it should be great. Looking forward to reading that and talking about it with you here next week. All right. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.